So in the previous video, we saw how to analyze a dataset using filters in Google Sheets or by using formulas. But what can you do when dealing with a dataset which includes thousands upon thousands of rows of data? I will show you how to use pivot tables, and that being said, pivot tables can be used with pretty much any data set, but they are particularly interesting and useful when dealing with a massive amount of data. So the data set we will use for this demonstration comes from Open Data Ottawa. It is called 2020 Monthly Service Requests, was last updated at the time of recording on October 2nd, 2020, and it is available as an Excel spreadsheet. Here's a bit more information about the dataset. So the data in this dataset provides a summary of requests for service that require action by city staff in Ottawa. Data is presented by ward and shows the responsible city department and service request description. Service requests may be received from citizens through the following channels. People can call the 311 call center. Citizens may show up at a client service center. They can send an email, or they can use the web-based self-service portal. And there is also a note on accuracy. Please note that system updates and data extraction practices changed, facilitating a cleaner, more meaningful dataset from 2016 forward. So we now know that in those related datasets, anything before 2016 may include information that is less reliable or a bit messier. So we'll come back up here and I will download the dataset. And in this case, it will download an Excel spreadsheet here. I will minimize this window. I will come to my Google Sheets spreadsheet, which I had already created, and I will explain why in a second. It's already populated, but let's pretend that you are doing this from scratch and you need to import the dataset. You would click on File, Import, Upload, select a file from your device. You would come to your Downloads folder, open it, it would upload it. Then you would select Replace Spreadsheet and Import Data, and it would take a few seconds to a few minutes because it is a rather massive data set. But for now, I've already done those first steps for two main reasons. First, we have way over 200,000 rows of data. So that's that would be too massive to deal with at once. It took me a few minutes to upload it, but I do invite you to try it at home. The second reason why is that this column here was a bit messy. So for instance, Orleans was spelled two different ways. Sometimes you would have Ward 1 Orleans. Sometimes you would have just Ward you would just have the name of the ward, so Orleans and so on. So I decided to clean up the data set for you to make it easier, and I will give you a link to this particular cleaned up version of the data set if you want to play around with it. Now I have thousands upon thousands of rows of data, over 200,000 rows. To be more precise, 233,130 rows of data, minus the first row, so we have 129 actually. So what I will do is that I will come back up and I will select all, either by clicking on this particular cell here, or you could do Control A or Command A on a Mac. Data, Pivot Table, New Sheet. I am now creating a pivot table, and you saw in the top right corner there was this progress bar, so be patient, it is a rather heavy data set. A pivot table, in a nutshell, is a tool which allows you to generate different data sets or sub-data sets based on your original one by using this tool here, the pivot table editor, and you can add rows, columns, values, and even use filters. So let's first populate this new pivot table, And we'll do something quite simple to start off. So I'll click on rows. I will put subject. And we now see that there are 11 different subjects for which people might want to call 311. And remember, we're talking about service requests here, not necessarily complaints. However, generally speaking, most of us don't call the city to congratulate city staff. It can happen, but if you're calling for roads and transportation, generally speaking, it might imply that you have a complaint to formulate. And I will double click here to widen my column. Let's come back here to the original data set. So we see that we have 6 columns: subject, reason, type. So subject kind of refers back to the department targeted by the request. Then the reason will be a generic reason, and then type will be kind of a subcategory of the reason. So for instance here, animals, you can have a dog at large, you can have a dog at large current or prior. So those are, so like the dog is running or someone caught it. You can have a dog barking and so on. You have the date on which the call was made, the channel, so whether someone called in, used the web app, walked up and whatnot, and then the ward. So we'll come back here, and what we will do now is come to columns, and I will once again select subject. So I'll click here, and actually not on columns, sorry, on values, and I will select subject. And I will leave it at count A. Now there is a new column here, column B, and count A means that it's counting every time it finds this value here, subject, right? So there are 50,189 instances in my data set where you would find bylaw services under subject. And in comparison, only 853 occurrences or instances where you would encounter corp complaints under subject. And I believe corp complaints are corporate complaints, if I'm not mistaken. So something relating to the city, we would need to double check it. It doesn't really matter in this particular case. But, you know, again, when dealing with a data set, those are the kinds of questions you would need to ask yourself. So right off the bat, we have a pretty basic data set, which we could turn into a data visualization. I could copy this data set, so those first 12 rows, so we would leave the grand total out, but I would copy my first row with my headers, and then the 11 different sets of values. I could copy that, paste it into data wrapper, as we saw earlier on this semester, and I could turn this into a pie chart site to show, you know, the percentage of calls made to the 311 service for a bylaw request or for a garbage and recycling request and so on. You can actually come back here to the right, and instead of showing by default, you could show as a percentage of the grand total. And now it will generate percentages, so it amounts to 100 or totals 100%. And then we see that roads and transportation accounted for roughly 33% of the service requests made to the 311 service over the first 10 months of 2020. Just behind, we have garbage and recycling at roughly 30%, and in third position, we have bylaw services, so 1 in 5 calls made to the city pertained to bylaw services. So I will reset that to default, and you see that automatically. It takes a few seconds. The progress bar was here. The data will come back to its original state. So that's a great thing with a pivot table, is that you can play around with the data and it's non-destructive. Our original data set stays the same. So it's pretty neat. I'll really erase all of that, and I will show you perhaps 2 more tricks, and then you will be able to play around with the same data set and create your own pivot table. So I've reset everything. The progress bar was still going on. Then let's come back to our rows, and we will select type. Now we will see that there are quite a few types of calls that can be made. We have about 438 of them. Always remove the first row. And if you come back up, you will see that under C, we have COVID-19. So let's widen our first column here. And in the values, we will also select type and count A. So it's going to count every single time the system encounters, say, COVID-19 in the type column. And now it tells us that there were 9,283 calls or service requests. I say calls, but really they're service requests because people can actually email them in or use the web app. But calls and requests in this context mean the same thing. So there were over 9,000 requests made to the 311 service regarding COVID-19. They could be complaints, they could be inquiries, we don't know, but we know that people did call nearly 10,000 times for COVID-19 related reasons. I will erase that once more. Let's say that you wanted to know how many reasons someone could call bylaw services for. So what we'll do is that we'll come back to our rows. Once the system comes back up, it's always a little slow. Don't worry, it is normal. So I will erase everything. I think I clicked on suggested by mistake. So I will just remove all of that. Bear with me. I will come to rows and I will put subject. Values, I will put reason. And I will put count unique. Now it's going to count the different possibilities under each subject. So animals is one reason that people may call bylaw services for. And if you go down, eventually we would hit noise and so on. So there are 19 different reasons why people may call 311 and request a bylaw officer. There are 4 different reasons for City Hall related requests and so on. We see that in total we have 79 reasons. We saw earlier though that if we were to use type, so here, if I were to erase everything, if we were to select type, we saw earlier that we had about 400 different types of requests that can be filed. So see it as like, that's your category, that's your subcategory, and that's the subcategory, right? Subject, reason, type. One last thing we could do is to create a somewhat more complex pivot table. So under rows, I will put the subjects, right? So the system is a bit sluggish. It tends to go a bit too fast. So add. So don't mind that. It's just the system tends to be very slow. And if I move too fast, I magically click on stuff that has yet to show up in the right-hand column. So I'll come back and put subject. And then under columns, I will put ward. And then under values, I will put, I'll wait for the system to generate, subject again, and then I will put count A. Now we have a grand total of calls made in each ward. And if we go to the very end, under grand total, we have 233,129 requests. So we know that it adds up. We have a grand total per subject at the very end. And we also have the total per ward. The first column here is empty. It means that the request wasn't attached to a particular ward. So there were nearly 11,000 requests made to the 311 service over the first 10 months of 2020, which didn't belong to a given ward, right? For bylaw services. And if you include all of the other subjects, there were nearly 16,000 requests which didn't pertain to a particular ward. Then if we go to Alta Vista, we'll see that there were, in the first 10 months of 2020, 1,800 1,807 requests, to be more precise, made to the 311 service for bylaw services and so on. You will notice that we have the wards, and if I wanted to line everything up, I could select everything, double click between two columns, and now the columns will get automatically resized. And then we have east, we have west, and we have, I believe, north as well. Those are sectors of the city. For whatever reason, instead of wards, they've included those as well. But it's kind of, I think there are like 4 or 5 entries total. So it's, you can almost ignore them. West Carleton March, here we see that, there were 5,069 requests, whereas in Somerset we had nearly 14,000 requests made. Kitchissippi, there were quite a few as well. Rideau Vanier, 15,000. So we could technically clean this up and turn it into a chart, say, which would illustrate the top 5 wards in which people made requests to the 311 service. I mean, the number of potential stories in this data set is very hard to imagine, because you could do a story about noise-related issues, about garbage and recycling. And the great thing when using such a data set is that it is not absolute, right? If I have issues with parking on my street but never call, you won't know. But generally speaking, if something is a big issue in a neighborhood, you can bet that some people will call the 311 service. So you cannot present those numbers as, the absolute reality, but this data set can give you a pretty good idea of the issues which are the main ones in any given neighborhood in the city. And then you could go there and talk to people and turn this data set into a real data-driven story. So once again, there is no one-size-fits-all approach when using pivot tables. My best advice to you would be to download either this data set or another data set and to spend, a few minutes or even an hour playing around, and that's really how you will learn to use a pivot table.